What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is a continuation of my overview as to how I've been doing the oil lines, the coolant lines, vacuum lines, etc., for swapping an O7k engine into my Porsche 944. This episode we're going to go over fuel lines, and the reason why I'm going into such nitty-gritty detail is that as a sort of normal guy who's not a mechanic or an engineer, I found that this has been a very difficult project to complete, and I just wanted to sort of go in extreme detail kind of how I decided to make these lines, and so that way you can follow in my footsteps, or maybe you have a better way to do it, but this is how I've done it. So I've already released the oil video. Today is going to be fuel, and we'll be seeing other things like coolant and vacuum coming up next, but there are a few systems that I'm going to wait until the car is driving regularly before I post a video for that. Alright, I think the easiest way to explain this is to start from the stock 944 setup and then go from there. So these are the stock 944 lines that come up through this side of the engine. One problem with these stock lines is that they actually have a tendency to, they're made out of nylon, I think, and as you can see, they're right next to the headers. And one of the problems with these cars is that in their stock form, they will actually tear up those fuel lines and then ignite on the header. So that's really not a great thing. You don't want to see that happen. To combat this, back before I turned this into an engine swap, I actually ordered replacement lines from Lindsay Racing. I think they're just AN6 lines that they fabricated, but they never turned up. And I remembered it, a couple of years later, so they refunded me that. And then they got me these connectors here, which is part of the reason why we have such spaghetti. They are essentially female to female connectors for a 10 millimeter for the route in, and then an 8 millimeter for the route back. And then they use NPT to AN6 lines, and that's how we connect up to the whole new aftermarket setup. So that is how we managed to get this set up here. So starting with the route in, we can see that we come straight to an AN6 fitting that's 90 degree, and it goes straight into our Aeromotive fuel pressure regulator. On the stock 944 setup, there is a couple of things over here. I think there's some sort of knock sensor that sits here. And then there is also the cruise control setup. I pulled all of that out. I'm not going to need it with this new setup here. And then put in rib nuts to hold the fuel pressure regulator here as well. Just a reminder, all of these parts will be listed in the description down below, so that way you can get everything that you need as well. I used a 180 degree AN6 fitting to go into the fuel pressure regulator, and then on the bottom here a 90 degree connection to go to a 180 to go back into the return line, back into the fuel tank. So that's this area here as far as the fuel pressure regulator goes. Now this Aeromotive fuel pressure regulator uses ORB or straight cuts AN6 or -6 lines, and so you're going to need 3 of those, and you can find them pretty much on Amazon. They're pretty straightforward to find. So that allows you to connect these ORB connections to the Aeromotive connection, and then to AN6 fittings. So next I used an AN6 fitting. This is a 45 degree to go to braided steel line, and the reason why I use braided steel line is the same reason that Lindsay Racing sells them this way. I wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to catch fire. So this is a lot more robust, and it'll make it, and it can stand up to the heat a lot better. This AN6 line snakes around to the front of the engine and goes into the fuel rail. This is an integrated engineering fuel rail. I talked a little bit about this in my lessons learned video, but you need to make sure that you're using the correct O-rings if you decide to go this route. You can reuse the stock O7k fuel rail as well, and I brought it into a 180 degree connection at the top, or at the front. Now, the fuel rail itself uses ORB-8 connections, so you need to make an ORB-8 to AN6 fitting. And then on the back here, there's actually a line out. Let me get a little bit of a light on that. And you need an ORB-8 cap to seal that off. And that is my fuel setup. A couple of other takeaways from this setup that I've seen other people do. For one thing, there's probably a less messy way to set up the connection between the stock fuel lines and the fuel pressure regulator that's up there. There's probably some sort of compression fitting, but again, I don't know that much about how to buy those, and I didn't want to start cutting my fuel lines. And Dave over at Lindsay Racing is really knowledgeable about how this setup exists on these cars. So he just, off the top of his head, knew that he had the parts in stock to make these adapters that would connect to the aftermarket AN6 line. The other thing that I've seen people do is they have connected the fuel pressure regulator to the front of the engine. I was initially going to go that route because I liked having more routing for lines that wasn't all so busy back here where everything else is routing. But after talking to Spencer, the mechanical engineer who's been helping me with this build, he thought that it would be dangerous to have the fuel pressure regulator posted up on the engine itself, because the vibration of the engine could actually damage the delicate FPR. So do keep that in mind. One other thing to take a note is that there is a vacuum line that's coming off of the fuel pressure regulator. You can see this blue here, that's 1/8 of an inch, and I used a silicone line, vacuum line, because that can help dissipate heat a lot better than just a rubber one. And that is useful because it helps the fuel pressure regulator identify how much vacuum exists, so that way it can provide more fuel to help with the fuel air mixture. I'm going NA, and from what I understand, that isn't necessarily needed. However, more information is better, so I'm going to continue to do that. I do know that if you're going turbocharging, that is a requirement, so do just keep that in mind. So fuel setup is really straightforward. It's a couple of very straightforward lines. I would also just, as a side note, make sure that everything is really tight. I thought it was, and there were multiple times throughout the course of the installation where we had fuel, once we got the fuel pump working, where it started to spill all over the place. So make sure it's tight, you know, one UGA or something like that once you've got it together. But that's pretty much it. Hope this was helpful. We'll see you all in the next video. Take care.